Okay, and now we have Richard to talk about the complexities of star clusters.
Right, thank you, Tanya. Tanya was worried about pronouncing my surname, so just Richard will do. I respond to most pronunciations, so that's okay. Before I start, I'd like to make two confessions. First of all, I'm talking about the complexities of star clusters, not necessarily massive star clusters, because the first novel results I'll be showing are about open clusters in the Milky Way, so they're not very massive. Secondly, none of the work I'll be describing was done just by myself. A lot of the work was done by students, and I would like to highlight the work of two students. On the left is Weijia Sun, who obtained his PhD 2 weeks ago. He's moving on to a fellowship at the Leibniz Institute in Potsdam. He wrote a fantastic thesis, 8 first author papers in 5 years, so that's really good. The lady on the right is Shalmali Kapsu. She submitted her thesis a day after Weijia got his, and she is moving on to a data scientist position in Sydney. But they did most of the work, and so I would like to highlight what they did. Now, 2 decades ago, we thought we understood star clusters. Star clusters were simple stellar populations, composed all of a single age, hardly any age range. And since they were born from the same same molecular cloud, they all had the same chemical composition. And that was it. Very narrow features in the column magnitude diagram. You see a very narrow main sequence, very narrow, a very sharp main sequence turnoff, red giant branch, etc. The only difference would be the stellar masses given by the initial mass function, ranging from the hydrogen burning limit at the bottom of the main sequence to, in this particular case, about 0.6 to 0.8 solar masses at the main sequence turnoff. This particular column magnitude diagram that I'm showing you here is a composite of 5 galactic globular clusters. They're all 10 to 12 billion years old. So the combination of them, gives you this diagram. The problem is that even in such simple diagrams, there are deviations from that simple stellar population model, as shown particularly here. There are features associated with binarity. In fact, most stars in the universe form in binary systems, and that is not contained in simple stellar population models. So that idea had to be thrown out of the door. Then, of course, about late 1990s, early 2000s, the Hubble Space Telescope started to produce a lot of data, including a lot of data of younger star clusters, where we saw that their features were not so narrow, not as narrow as predicted by the simple stellar population model. They had broadened main sequences. A lot of that could be attributed to binarity, but also broadened extended main sequence turnoffs. And particularly as regards to main sequence turnoffs, there were 4 or 5 different explanations, including differences in helium abundances. That doesn't do the trick, because increasing your helium abundance makes your population bluer and not redder, which is what we see in terms of an extension of the main sequence turnoff. Binary populations can only do so much, and mostly along the main sequence itself, possibly a range in stellar ages and or metallicities, and possibly a population of rapidly rotating stars. And I'll talk about both of these latter 2 options in the next 8 minutes or so. So let's talk about stellar rotation. This was meant to be a Galah project, but in the end, the students, Weijia, worked on completely different data, so we'll have to deal with that. It turned out that if you look at star clusters in the Magellanic Clouds, because that's what we're talking about, you look at their, this is the age mass diagram of star clusters in the Magellanic Clouds. The clusters shown in brownish circles all show deviations from that simple stellar population model. The clusters shown in blue squares resemble simple stellar populations. And that transition happened somewhere near 2 gigayears. And the clusters shown in red are clusters that were not had not been studied at the time that we started our study. So they were interesting because that would tell us where the mass and age cutoff was for the appearance or the occurrence of multiple stellar populations or deviations from the simple stellar population. But we wanted to get spectroscopy, and spectroscopy of individual stars in the Magellanic Clouds is really hard to do, particularly at the level that we needed it to go to. And so using guaranteed time on SALT that we got through collaborators at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, we selected a number of open clusters in the Milky Way that were aged between 1 and 3 billion years and showed clear evidence of an extended main sequence turnoff. And here is just an example of that. We used Gaia proper motions to identify members of the cluster, and you can see the bottom right-hand picture shows you the members, and also it's very, very clearly a binary sequence on top of the main sequence and an extended main sequence turnoff. When Jai looked at this in detail, he got spectra. We got the salt spectra of stars at the main sequence turnoff, and they're color-coded here by their rotational velocities. And this was the first evidence, really, that the extended main sequence turnoffs are driven by differences in stellar rotation rates. That had been suggested, but had not been shown. And I would say Wei Jia single-handedly made his mark in the field, and he wrote quite a few papers on this topic, and he actually set the standard there. So stellar rotation causes differences in stellar rotation cause an extended main sequence turnoff. Now, I don't have an awful lot of time, so I'd like to talk to just about one other cluster. That's NGC 2287, quite young, 2 times 10 to the 8 years, fairly massive, 10 to the 4 solar masses. They did the same kind of thing. You see the binaries there along the main sequence. But interestingly, along the main sequence, we found 2 parallel main sequences in blue and in red. And in yellow or ochre, that's the binary sequence. And those two parallel main sequences were quite clearly identifiable. Based on spectroscopy, we found out that there was a clear difference in their rotational velocities. So it was a clear dichotomy in stellar rotation velocities in this particular fairly massive open cluster. On the right is a model that shows you that we can reproduce this by having 2 populations with different rotation rates. In fact, we tried quite a lot of different models, and we found that if you look at the cumulative distribution of the V sin I, the best model was the model shown here in the red line called case 3, which was a bimodal distribution in equatorial velocities combined with a uniform distribution of inclination angles. So that was the bimodal distribution here is the point. How can you get that? Well, I'll talk about it in just a second, but it's most likely tidal synchronization. Here is another way of showing you that, color versus V sin I, and there's a clear difference there. But since I've been given my 2 minutes, I'll move on to the next topic I would like to talk about. Well, first of all, this, if you look for a larger sample of clusters, if you separate the slow and the fast rotators, and look at their fraction as a function of binary fraction in those clusters, there is a clear trend here that goes almost up linearly here, and we believe that what we see here is tidal synchronization due to tidal braking. Finally, I would like to talk briefly about Cholmolly's work. She was working on some of the very clusters around that those transitions, those reddish clusters. And since there's not much time, I'll talk about one cluster in particular, NGC 2173, 1.7 gigayears old. And if you look at the tip of the red giant branch there, and that's the inset in the bottom left figure, it looks like there are two parallel sequences. This was the first time that deviations from simple stellar populations were found along the red giant branch of fairly young star clusters, intermediate age star clusters. We did some modeling of that, and that is a clear dichotomy. And we found that there is no way that we can actually reproduce this in the models by looking at a whole variety of things that we could have done wrong. So this is real. This is a real dichotomy in multiple stellar populations along the red giant branch of that particular cluster. It's definitely broader or wider, the distribution is wider than expected from simple stellar populations. That's a plot on the right here, where you see in blue the artificial star tests we did, and in red the broadened distribution as observed. I'm running out of time, but this shows you in essence the same thing using what's called chromosome plots, which was supported by our modeling using Gaussian mixture modeling. So in all cases, we have found the first young star cluster with multiple stellar populations along its red giant branch, and that cluster is younger than the 2 gigayear cutoff that we had identified. So to leave you with my take-home messages, and intermediate ages, and we're talking here 1 to 3 gigayears, extended main sequence turnoffs imply the presence of a population of rapidly rotating main sequence turnoff stars. That seems like a linear function of of that extension. A simple stellar population, including rapidly rotating stars, seems the best match to young and intermediate age clusters. And we have now found the youngest cluster showing evidence of multiple populations at 1.7 gigayears. Thank you very much.